cop in the abandoned house never showed me his face, and years later, I found out there had never been a police officer assigned to that area at all. I was 18 back then, angry at the world, dramatic over nothing, and convinced my parents were the enemy. We fought constantly, but that night was different. Screaming turned into shoving. Doors slammed hard enough to shake the walls, and eventually my dad pointed at the door and told me not to come back until I learned how to act like a human being. So I left. At first it felt good. I wandered around town pretending I didn't care, kicking rocks across empty sidewalks while replaying the argument in my head like I was the victim in some movie. But by the time the streetlights flickered on and the last stores closed, reality finally hit me. I had nowhere to go. I could have called a friend, sure, but I knew one of their parents would contact mine, and my stubborn teenage ego couldn't handle crawling back home after only a few hours. So instead, I made the worst decision of my life. I decided to spend the night in the abandoned house at the end of Briarwood Road. Every kid in town knew about that place. It sat behind a dead-end street swallowed by weeds and trees, hidden so deep in overgrowth it looked less like a house and more like something the forest was trying to bury. Years earlier, my friends and I had explored it during the daytime. Back then it was just creepy in a fun way. At night, it was something else entirely. I reached the property around 10 p.m. The entire street was silent. No cars, no porch lights, just the distant buzzing of power lines and the sound of branches scraping together overhead. A rusted chain-link gate blocked the driveway, though half of it had collapsed years ago. I slipped through the opening and immediately felt the temperature drop. The deeper I walked, the quieter everything became. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Then the house appeared through the trees. The sight of it made my stomach tighten. The structure looked rotten and wrong, like it had been dead for years, but somehow still standing out of pure hatred. Vines strangled the walls. The windows were boarded shut, like someone wanted to keep people out, or keep something in. The broken front door still hung open exactly how I remembered it. I stepped inside. The smell hit me instantly. Mold, wet wood, and something else underneath it. Something sour and rotten that I couldn't identify. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness. Every room looked frozen in time. Dust covered the floors, so thick it looked like gray snow. Torn wallpaper curled off the walls. The ceiling sagged overhead like it could collapse any second. And despite the decay, something felt occupied, not abandoned. Occupied. I told myself I was paranoid. Still, the second I reached the staircase, I already knew there was no chance I'd actually sleep there. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but curiosity kept pulling me deeper. I climbed halfway upstairs when I heard it. Creak, a footstep downstairs. I froze instantly. Another creak followed near the front hallway. Not old house noises. Actual footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Every hair on my body stood up. Then I heard a door open somewhere below me, near the entrance I'd used. I stopped breathing. Whoever was down, there was now standing between me and the only exit. For several seconds, I waited to hear more movement. Nothing came. That somehow felt worse. The silence stretched on so long my ears started ringing. It felt like whoever entered wasn't searching the house. They were listening for me. I stayed frozen on the staircase for what felt like forever, staring into the darkness below while my imagination spiraled completely out of control. Then my brain tried comforting itself. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe the wind pushed a door open. Maybe whoever came in had already left. I clung to those lies because the alternative was terrifying. Finally, after nearly 10 minutes, I forced myself to move. Slowly, I stepped back downstairs, each creak beneath my shoes sounding deafening. I reached the corner near the hallway and carefully peeked around it. Nobody there. My pulse eased slightly. Then I turned toward the open doorway and almost screamed. A man was standing directly in front of it, perfectly still, already staring at me. I hadn't heard him move. I hadn't heard him breathe. It was like he had materialized there. Before I could react, his voice cut through the darkness. Stop right there. The words hit me like ice water. He was wearing a police uniform, at least something that looked like one. The shadows hid most of his face, but even in the darkness, I could tell something was wrong. The uniform hung loosely off his body like it belonged to someone much larger. His shoulders were too narrow. The sleeves dangled past his wrists. And his posture, God, I still remember his posture. Tall, crooked, like his bones bent in places they shouldn't. "You shouldn't be here, kid," he said. His voice sounded deep, wet, almost slurred, like he was speaking through a mouth full of blood. I stammered out an apology and said I'd leave immediately. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there unmoving, thinking. Then he took one slow step toward me. "Did you come here alone?" The question sent a cold wave through my chest. Something about the way he asked it felt horribly wrong. Not concerned, interested, hungry. I swallowed hard and quietly said yes. Another step. "And what exactly were you looking for in this house?" At that point, my instincts were screaming that this was not a cop. Everything about him felt fake. The uniform, the voice, even the way he spoke sounded rehearsed, like someone pretending to be human after only hearing conversations secondhand. I shook my head, unable to answer. Then he smiled. I still couldn't fully see his face, but I saw enough. And the second I did, I understood why nobody in town ever went near that house after dark. The man's face twitched in the darkness like he was smiling. And that was the exact moment I realized I was standing inches away from something dangerous pretending to be human. For a second, neither of us moved. Then slowly, almost casually, he turned away from me and walked toward the room I'd heard him come out of earlier. The doorway was nothing but blackness. Not normal darkness, but the kind that felt thick, like it swallowed the light before it could touch the walls inside. He stopped at the entrance and leaned one arm against the frame. "Come here." His voice sounded calm now, almost friendly, but underneath it was something rotten, something violent. I stayed frozen at the bottom of the hallway, my pulse hammering so hard I could feel in my throat. The man straightened slightly and pushed the door open wider. The hinges groaned through the house like an animal crying out in pain. "Come here," he repeated, more demanding this time. Every instinct inside me was screaming the same thing. That was not a police officer. The uniform was wrong. The voice was wrong. And whatever waited inside that room was worse. Then I noticed something critical. By moving to the doorway, he was no longer blocking the exit. He was still only a few feet away from the front door, but it was enough. Enough for one chance. I took it, without warning. I exploded into a sprint straight toward the entrance. The second I moved, the man lunged at me with terrifying speed. His hand caught the collar of my shirt. For one horrifying second, the fabric tightened around my throat so hard I couldn't breathe. I felt myself jerk backward as his fingers dug into me like hooks. Then the shirt slipped from his grip. I stumbled free and bolted out of the house. Behind me, I heard heavy footsteps slam against the wooden floorboards. Then screaming, not words, just this furious animal-like roar echoing through the farmhouse and out into the trees. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, straight through the woods. Branches tore across my face. Mud splashed at my legs. I didn't dare look behind me because some deep primal part of me believed if I did, I would see him chasing me, or worse, see him standing perfectly still between the trees, watching. I didn't stop running until I reached town, and when I finally made it home, nearly collapsing onto the driveway, I saw red and blue lights flashing across the front of the house. A real police car. My parents had reported me missing after I never came home, and none of my friends knew where I was. 2 actual officers were standing in the driveway talking to my dad when I staggered up covered in dirt and soaked in sweat. I should have told them everything right there, but I didn't. I was too terrified, too confused, and honestly, part of me was scared I'd get arrested for breaking into the abandoned house or for running from who I thought might have been an officer. So I kept my mouth shut. But later that night, lying awake in bed, replaying everything in my head, one detail made my blood run cold. Neither officer ever asked me about the farmhouse. Not once. If there had really been another cop out there, every patrol unit in town would have known within minutes. They would have had my description. They would have questioned me immediately, which meant the thing inside that house was never a police officer at all. And to this day, I still don't know what would have happened if I had listened to him and walked into that room. But that wasn't the only abandoned place that nearly got me killed growing up in that town. For the first 20 years of my life, I lived in a tiny countryside community where absolutely nothing ever happened. No crime, no excitement, just endless fields, dirt roads, and silence. As a kid, it felt like the most boring place on earth. So whenever rumors spread about somewhere haunted or abandoned, every teenager in town became obsessed with it. And there was one place everyone knew: the old farmhouse. It sat miles outside town in the middle of an enormous field surrounded by nearly 200 acres of dead land the county had owned for decades. The original family who lived there died long before I was born, and after that, the property was simply abandoned. No one touched it. No one bought it. The county fenced it off with rusted signs that read state property. And no trespassing. But even from the road, you could still see the farmhouse sitting out there alone like a corpse left behind after a war. People told stories about it constantly. Lights moving upstairs at night. Voices coming from inside. Animals refusing to go near it. Most of us assumed the stories were nonsense. Then one summer when I was 17, my best friend Marcus and I decided to explore it ourselves. At the time, it sounded fun. By the end of that night, we would both regret ever setting foot on that land. We parked Marcus's car near the edge of town and walked almost a mile through overgrown grass toward the property. Since cops occasionally patrol the area, we avoided crossing the open field and instead followed the fence line around to the woods behind the farmhouse. That way nobody could see us approaching. The closer we got, the worse the place looked. The wood covering the farmhouse had turned almost completely black from age and weather. Vines crawled across the walls like veins. Every window looked dead and hollow. Yet somehow, the structure still stood perfectly intact. No collapsed roof, no broken walls. It looked less abandoned and more like something waiting. We hurried to the side of the house and found an old open window just big enough to climb through. I went first, dropping into the darkness inside, before helping Marcus through after me. The second we both landed on the floor, silence swallowed us whole. Our flashlight beams cut through thick clouds of dust, drifting through the air like smoke on a battlefield. The house smelled ancient. Rotting wood, mold, and something else underneath it. Something metallic, like old blood. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The floorboards groaned beneath every step as we slowly moved deeper into the farmhouse. Even though we tried acting calm, I could tell Marcus felt it too. That heavy pressure in the air, the feeling you get when a place doesn't want you there. Then suddenly Marcus grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. "Sam," he whispered, his flashlight pointed upward toward the ceiling above us. And that's when I saw it, a dim orange light glowing through the cracks between the floorboards upstairs. Moving. The orange glow barely lit the room at all. It wasn't bright enough to illuminate the walls or the floor. Just a weak, flickering pulse leaking through the cracks in the wood like something breathing behind the door. Marcus and I stood there frozen at the end of the hallway, staring at it. Neither of us said a word, because deep down, we both knew something was wrong. There should not have been light inside that farmhouse. Not after decades of abandonment. Not in a place that looked like the entire world had forgotten it existed. Every instinct told us to turn around and leave right then. But curiosity is a dangerous thing when you're young, especially in places where people were never meant to go. Slowly, we walked down the hallway toward the glowing door. The old floorboards groaned beneath our feet with every step, echoing through the farmhouse like distant gunfire in an empty battlefield. Upstairs was nothing but a narrow hallway lined with closed bedroom doors. Most of them looked swollen shut from age and moisture. But one door near the end stood out immediately, because underneath it, that strange orange light flickered like firelight. And yet, the entire house remained deathly silent. No whispering, no movement, no breathing, nothing. That was the part that disturbed me most. If people were inside, we should have heard them. The farmhouse was ancient. Every step we took sounded like it shook the entire structure. There was no way someone upstairs wouldn't know we were there. Still, there wasn't a single sound coming from the room. I slowly stepped closer and pressed my ear against the door. Silence. Absolute silence. I looked back at Marcus. He looked pale already, gripping his flashlight so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Then, against every survival instinct we had, I reached for the handle. The second I pushed the door open, the hinges released a long, violent creak that echoed through the entire house. And what I saw inside nearly stopped my heart. There were people in the room. 3 of them, maybe more. It was hard to tell. They were kneeling in a tight circle on the floor, surrounded by candles. Their heads lowered towards something in the center I couldn't fully see. The candlelight barely revealed their shapes. Just dark outlines hunched together in complete stillness. Motionless. Not one of them reacted to the door opening. Not one of them looked at us. Marcus and I had been stomping around that farmhouse for several minutes, making enough noise to wake the dead. And yet those people hadn't moved an inch. It felt wrong. Unnatural. Like we had walked into the middle of something we were never supposed to witness. For about 3 seconds, I stood there unable to breathe, staring at them. Then Marcus grabbed my arm so hard it hurt and yanked me backward. That snapped me out of it. We turned and hurried down the stairs as quietly as we could, though adrenaline made every footstep sound thunderous in my ears. My entire body was shaking. We weren't even speaking anymore. Pure instinct had taken over. Get out. Get out now. Marcus reached the window first and climbed through it almost frantically. I was halfway out behind him when the silence upstairs suddenly exploded. Thud, thud, thud. Heavy footsteps. Fuss. Multiple people sprinting across the second floor. The entire farmhouse shook violently as whoever was upstairs came charging toward the staircase. I practically threw myself through the window. The second my boots hit the ground, Marcus and I took off running full speed toward the woods without looking back. Behind us, the old farmhouse groaned loudly in the wind. Then came another sound. A massive slam echoed across the property. At the time we assumed it was the window crashing shut behind us. But honestly, neither of us truly knew. We didn't stop running until we disappeared deep into the tree line. Even then, we only slowed enough to catch our breath. Both of us were trembling. My head pounded so badly it felt like I'd been in a car wreck. Marcus leaned against a tree, trying not to throw up while we struggled to process what we had just seen. None of it made sense. Who were those people? What were they doing in that abandoned farmhouse? And why didn't they move until we ran? The walk back to town felt endless. Neither of us talked much during the drive home. And strangely enough, over the next few days, we almost completely avoided bringing it up. Like part of us wanted to erase the memory entirely. Eventually, life moved on. I graduated high school, left town for college, and years later, I happened to drive past the old property again. The farmhouse was gone, completely demolished. And honestly, I was relieved, because whatever was happening inside that room that night was something I never wanted to understand. But as terrifying as that experience was, it still wasn't the creepiest place I ever explored. A few years later, while backpacking across the West Coast, I stumbled across something far worse. At the time, I had taken an entire month off just to hike. I planned out trail after trail through forests, mountains, and remote camping routes across several states. Most of the places I visited were normal hiking destinations, except one. A friend of mine who was obsessed with abandoned places told me about an old mining town hidden deep in the mountains. He said almost nobody visited it because, unlike most ghost towns scattered across dry deserts, this one had been swallowed by dense forest over the last 100 years. That immediately caught my attention. I'd explored dozens of abandoned mining towns before, but forest towns were different. The wilderness preserved them in an eerie way. Cabins remained standing. Furniture stayed untouched. Nature slowly consumed everything instead of burying it in sand. Places like that felt frozen in time. And if you were searching for raw, undisturbed ruins, they were the holy grail. The town sat only a few miles off on the backpacking trails I was already hiking, so I decided to check it out before returning to my campsite later that day. I arrived around midday beneath thick gray clouds that covered the mountains and turned the entire forest dim and colorless. The place immediately felt wrong. Beautiful, but wrong. Tiny wooden cabins stood scattered between towering pine trees, half consumed by moss and roots. Nature had almost reclaimed the entire settlement. Some buildings leaned at strange angles, while others remained shockingly intact despite being abandoned for over a century. And the strangest part? There are no signs anyone had visited in years. No footprints, no trails between the buildings, no graffiti, nothing. The town felt untouched, like it had simply been left behind one day and forgotten forever. I explored several cabins during the first half hour. One still contained an old wooden rocking chair, sitting perfectly upright beside a crumbling shelf. Another had rusted tools scattered across the floor exactly where someone had dropped them decades earlier. But the longer I stayed there, the stronger this horrible feeling became. That sensation every human being recognizes deep down. The feeling of being watched. I kept turning around suddenly, scanning between the trees behind me, convinced someone was moving through the forest just out of sight. And with every minute that passed, that feeling only got worse. At first, I convinced myself the fear was all in my head. Anyone would feel uneasy walking alone through a forgotten mining town buried deep in the mountains. Places like that carry a different kind of silence. Not peaceful silence, dead silence. The kind that feels like the forest itself is holding its breath. Still, I try to ignore the feeling. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination reacting to the isolation, the rotting buildings, the endless trees pressing in from every direction. Most abandoned mining towns I'd explored before sat exposed on dry desert hills under open skies. This place was different. The forest swallowed everything. Every cabin, every path, every sound, and somehow that made it feel less abandoned and more hidden. Eventually, I reached the far edge of the town where the trees opened up against the side of the mountain. That's when I saw the mine entrance, a massive black opening carved directly into the rock. The sight of it stopped me cold. Even standing outside in broad daylight, I could barely see a few feet inside before the tunnel disappeared into complete darkness. Not normal darkness either. This was absolute blackness, the kind that looked thick enough to swallow light itself. I stood at the entrance for almost a full minute without moving, because there was a sound coming from deep inside. A low, endless rumble. Not loud, not sharp, just this deep vibration echoing through the tunnel system like the mountain itself was growling in its sleep. The closer I got, the more I felt it inside my chest. It vibrated through my ribs, through my teeth, and with every second, this crushing sense of dread kept building stronger and stronger. I can't explain it properly. It felt ancient, wrong, like standing too close to something you were never supposed to find. The longer I stared into the mine, the stranger my eyes started acting. My vision kept trying to focus on shapes moving inside the darkness, but there was nothing there, or at least nothing I could clearly see. My brain started inventing figures in the blackness. Tall shapes, movement, people standing just beyond where the light reached. I took maybe 2 steps inside before every muscle in my body locked up. Pure instinct, the kind of fear that bypasses logic completely. Every survival alarm in my brain screamed at me to get out. So I did. I turned around immediately and walked fast, almost jogging, back through the abandoned town. And the entire way back, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder toward the mine entrance. That horrible feeling of being watched had become overwhelming now, like something had noticed me the second I stepped near that tunnel. I stopped exploring after that, didn't even bother checking the remaining cabins. I just headed straight back toward the hiking trail where I'd set up camp earlier that afternoon. There were still a couple hours before sunset, so I forced myself to calm down and stick to routine. I cooked some food, prepared my pack for the next morning's hike, gathered firewood, and lit a campfire beside my tent. And honestly, I try not to think about the mine. Out in the wilderness alone, paranoia can become dangerous fast. Once fear takes over your mind, every sound becomes a threat. So I buried it, or at least I tried to. I sat beside the fire, poking at the flames with a stick while the forest slowly darkened around me. For a while, things felt normal again. the wind through the trees, branches creaking overhead, distant animal calls echoing across the mountains. But after a couple hours, the atmosphere changed completely. The forest stopped feeling peaceful. It started feeling alive. The animal noises became more frequent, but there was one sound in particular that kept getting under my skin. An elk, somewhere deep in the woods behind me. Every few minutes, it let out this loud bellow that echoed through the entire forest. At first I ignored it, but eventually I realized something strange. The sound never moved. It always came from the exact same direction, somewhere behind my campsite near the abandoned mining town. Every time it called out, chills ran through me. It didn't sound natural anymore. It sounded like a warning. Then suddenly, after doing it consistently for nearly an hour, the elk stopped. Complete silence swallowed the forest. No wind, no movement, nothing. That silence somehow felt worse. I found myself staring into the fire, lost in my thoughts, replaying the feeling I'd had inside the mine, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Then, snap! A sharp crack echoed somewhere behind the trees. My head whipped toward the sound instantly. And for reasons I still can't explain, my immediate thought wasn't animal. It was person, like some instinct buried deep inside me already knew somebody had been out there watching me the entire night. I stood up slowly and stared into the darkness beyond the reach of the firelight. Nothing moved, nothing appeared, but the feeling remained. Strong, heavy, wrong. After several seconds, I muttered, "Forget this," and immediately started packing my gear. For the next 5 minutes, everything stayed completely silent. No footsteps, no voices, no movement, but I trusted my instincts. When you're alone in the backcountry, ignoring that feeling can get you killed. I strapped my backpack shut, threw on my headlamp, and kicked dirt over the fire until the flames disappeared in the smoke and darkness. And the exact second the fire went out, I heard footsteps sprinting toward me from the trees. Fast, heavy, charging straight at my campsite. My headlamp barely illuminated a few feet ahead of me, nowhere near enough to see who or what was out there. I didn't wait to find out. I turned and ran, full speed down the trail. My backpack slammed against my shoulders while branches whipped across my face as I sprinted through the darkness. Every second, I expected to hear footsteps directly behind me. But strangely, they never came onto the trail. Whoever had been near my campsite stopped at the edge of the woods, almost like they didn't want to leave the forest or the mining town. I kept running anyway. I didn't stop until sunrise. By early morning, exhausted and running purely on adrenaline, I finally reached my car and got the hell out of those mountains. Later, I told my friend, the one who originally mentioned the abandoned mining town, everything that happened. He thought I was exaggerating, maybe even losing a little, but then he admitted something interesting. He had explored the town before, yet he never once went near the mine entrance, and he definitely never camped nearby afterward. He also told me something about elk behavior that still bothers me to this day. Sometimes elk repeatedly call out when they sense a predator or another presence nearby. Territorial warning calls. Looking back now, that animal may have been reacting to the exact same thing stalking me through the forest. Whatever was out there, I never saw it clearly. And honestly, I think that's for the best, because some places aren't abandoned. They're avoided.